So thank you all for coming. What I wanted to see if we could accomplish today comes from conversations that I've had, that CCA has had with historically Black colleges and universities throughout the digital learning infrastructure project, particularly around data and metrics in the PDP. But let me, I kind of just list those in the title, but there actually is a structure to it. Really talking about what metrics really matter and knowing for your college what to measure. And then from there, defining what your data needs are. And then from there, your software and reporting tools needs. And that's kind of encompassed through the PDP here. So I'm going to go through that. First, I'll do a brief overview of CCA. I know for those of you who have attended other workshops in this series, there's probably been a decent amount of depth regarding Complete College America, so I'm not going to go in too far, but I do think some of what we do is relevant and foundational to the rest of this conversation today. So again, I'm going to go over some things. I hope it's really tactically useful, and I do look forward to seeing if there are questions or comments as we proceed. So let me, where did my slideshow go? Sorry, one second. Okay, so CCA, our mission, I won't read this, but I just want to talk about how our HBCU DLI work has coincided with our mission. So we work to dramatically increase college completion rates and close any institutional performance gaps that might exist in those graduation rates, particularly if they're demographic or if they're by household income background or anything. It could even be academic, such as full-time status versus part-time status or based on academic readiness needs. And we do that by working with partners to make sure that we are able to scale the reform efforts that we're working on. And a big portion of that has been with the colleges and universities we've been working with. And this project in particular has been dramatic in that regard and in that spirit of partnership, because it's been co-designed from the get-go, just truly understanding from HBCUs what is required to best help the students that HBCUs serve, and then making sure that Complete College America and anybody that we're working with on this project is first and foremost a service provider, just making sure that we're helping you be able to do your jobs. And so I'm going to go really quick through this, but I mean, this is our alliance. Typically, we work with our alliance members, 39 states, 9 other members. So an example of a member that's not a state is, like the CUNY system or Washington, D.C., where there's not necessarily a state or a state representative, but there are alliance representatives, as would also be the case with Puerto Rico. But this is work that complements our work that we do with colleges. And in the HBCU DLI project, and the Digital Learning Infrastructure Project, this is very helpful because there are policy ramifications, particularly for advocacy for HBCUs, that need to go to the state level, where so much of the higher education policy action happens. So to that point, we work throughout our alliance and we work across colleges on 3 different levers at once. Those are policy, perspective, and practice. So making sure that the right practices that work for your college are able to take root. A big part of the ability to take root is to make sure that there is fertile ground for it. That's very often done through policy. And then a big portion of that is perspective. And what that is almost like meetings like this and publications and related things that move a college completion movement, particularly for students who attend colleges that may have been, for whatever reason, left behind in the college completion movement. Very often, maybe there's, a lack of funding or a lack of infrastructure or capacity to be able to push forward on these things. So, that last piece I just mentioned about that is about having the resources and being able to participate in the college completion movement. That's helped us define our values, which we, redid a few years ago to emphasize at the outset, not just student centrism, here in your top left, and the equitable structures and outcomes, but really, today, the focus on data-informed decision-making, not to go crazy about data for the sake of going crazy about it, but The idea being that there are different ways to understand student reality as you're trying to improve it. And so what are those best ways? And data, I would venture, is perhaps, particularly quantitatively, perhaps one of, if not the best ways, because it's a very democratic way of looking at how your college is doing, how your students are doing, because it puts everybody on the same footing. It doesn't pedestal the most recent story or some, tremendous anecdote. And then also, we work with cohorts as well as across our alliance. So that's certainly been true for the HBCU digital learning infrastructure experience. So then that way we can make changes at scale. So not just one college, and within a college, not just a few courses or sections, but really trying to get to 100% coverage on reforms that we know work. And to that point, what reforms do we know work? Again, when we're talking about data and metrics and even tools like the PDP, none of that matters if we're not clear about what we are trying to do, what student success reforms we're trying to push, and how we're going to measure them, and what we think will be improved upon or moved because of that sort of measurement. So because of that, we have 4 different categories of student success reforms that are purpose, structure, momentum, and support. I like to sometimes use a guided pathways metaphor for this, because I think everybody on the call by now is probably familiar with the pathways metaphor. But if we think of it that way, your purpose strategies are the ability to, or the capacity to work with students to help them set a destination for their academic journey, usually in alignment with what they seek out of their career as well as their personal aspirations. So that's why, unsurprisingly, you see reform efforts centered around first-year experience and career exploration, academic and career alignment, and adult learner engagement. The idea is, once you have that destination, what's your route, right? What's your semester by semester experience? And within those semesters, what is the schedule such that students can manage their lives around college instead of the other way around? So that's where there's not just, by the way, the ones that are in bold are old familiar CCA game changers that are just in this new, more comprehensive framework that we've put out in recent years. But if you've got academic maps and milestones, that's what I just mentioned, semester by semester, you have an idea of what you need to take. And so the trick is to make sure students are actually registering according to academic plan. But of course, each one of those academic plans should have the appropriate math for that plan. So very often, sometimes you'll just have STEM related math like pre-calculus, calc route stuff, regardless of what the pathway is. And, increasingly, we're seeing colleges adopt this strategy of assuring that whether it's statistics or quantitative literacy, that the right math is lining up with the right academic pathway such that students are getting exactly the learning that they need. Setting up meta majors. So, some colleges call these academies or focus areas, but sort of grouping academic programs into 6 to 10 different areas. So it's easy to navigate what colleges offer instead of just having an alphabetical list of all programs. One interesting bit of higher ed trivia is that accounting is one of the most popular majors. And it's not because so many students necessarily want to go into accounting, but it's because when catalogs list of programs alphabetically, accounting shows up really, really early and ends up being chosen just for that, especially when students don't benefit from the types of reforms in the purpose pillar to make that sort of choice. So if we're making sure students have a strong destination or purpose, we're making sure that they have a strong route or structure, then what's the speed at which they're traveling down their academic journey? Lots of reforms that you're probably familiar with are in here, but if a student, just to go over a few of them, if a student has, say, academic readiness needs in math and English, how do you make sure that they're able to take readiness coursework alongside college credit bearing coursework such that they don't have to take courses that don't count towards graduation requirements but eat up financial aid? If students are in high school, can they take college credit alongside that on that sort of structured pathway? If a student is full-time, are they advised to 12 credit hours, which is the federal definition for financial aid for full-time, or are they advised from 15? Does the advising conversation start at 5 courses or 15 credits, working down to 12 if need be, as opposed to 12 up? And then finally, support, the kind of the guardrails, right? What are the different academic supports, advising supports, and basic needs supports to make sure that students are able to stay on track? we go over a lot of this at our convenings, and increasingly in the, I don't think we can call this the post-pandemic era, but in the ongoing, increasingly virtual pandemic time, we have webinars such as this, but really bringing things to life and cross-pollinating ideas across colleges and across Alliance members on how things are going with the reform efforts that I just mentioned on the prior slide. And so when it comes to making that change, we generally follow 5 steps, making sure that we're identifying what's really needed at your college or university, convening the team, rallying around a shared vision for making that change, but then finally getting into the actions, and then ultimately monitoring to implement and refine. Our impact is very strong. I do want to start getting into the metrics and data portion. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but the reason I included it is because the idea is not only do we want to talk about using data and metrics on an ongoing basis at your college, but then of course at CCA, we use it as well to make sure that our interventions are having the reforms that we intend. And they do. And we've been in the news a lot for this. Frankly, I think we need to update this slide because a lot of our work, in particular with Hbcus and elsewhere, but coming out through and after the pandemic period, continues to drive the reform efforts that have been making these types of changes only accelerate across the country. So getting to the metrics for success, for measuring how you're doing on reforms such as these, and knowing whether it's working or not. Very often when we think about data, we think about the data that we sometimes submit to IBEDS, for example, right? The information on how students are graduating and at what rates and at what counts. And these are very important end goal metrics, but these are ultimately lagging indicators. So if you're looking to introduce a reform that, say, will help part-time students, very often part-time students take at least 6 years to graduate. And while time is enemy, and we believe that we should introduce as many reforms as possible to help build momentum for part-time students and to help them afford college where it's possible to bring the right sets of reforms together to allow for that affordability so they can attend full-time. Very often it's going to take a long time. And if you're measuring your reforms, you can't wait 6 years, 8 years, 10 years to see whether a reform works by analyzing grad rates that come out many years after you've implemented a reform that impacts new students. You need to know the measures that predict college completion such that you are able to make changes in real time or close to real time to be able to do the right work that would benefit the most students at your college. So I kind of went over this just as sort of idea of leading indicators and lagging indicators, and trying to come up with metrics that are going to work much more quickly for decision-making purposes. So, before diving into all that, one thing that's very important is that Hbcus already do achieve tremendous outcomes. So I don't want to, anything that I'm talking about here is about moving the needle further, and with the understanding that Hbcus have been largely underfunded and unjustly funded for many, many decades. And so to the extent that, we're talking about how to be able to use data at your college or university or metrics at your college or university to move forward on student success, we have to bear in mind the tremendous achievements that have already happened and what we're building upon, right? So just as an example, and I could have pulled lots of different data for this slide, but this is just showing that while Hbcus represent only 3% of colleges across the country, they represent 10% of all bachelor's degrees for Black students, and while and graduate nearly double that number relative to PWIs, and they represent more than a quarter of all STEM bachelor degrees, which is pretty incredible. I mean, that's multiples more than the 3%. That's 9 times the 3% of all colleges that they're representing. So this is really impressive work. And so much about DLI has been saying, well, if we had even more in terms of infrastructure, including around data, then HBCUs are as well positioned, maybe the best position of all colleges in the country, colleges and universities in the country, to do more, because they've done so much with, frankly, so little financially. So, a lot of the DLI experience has been about coming up with what a new post-pandemic new normal could look like, and what sort of resources would be advocated for. And that's where data and metrics came out as one of the highest priorities. So what do I mean when I say data has come out as one of the highest priorities? I want to spend some time on this slide. There's a lot on it, so that's reason enough to spend time. But, on the left-hand side, these are essentially, in synopsis, what we have heard about the struggles that colleges and universities have had with not just the availability of data, but even having the right metrics for decision support purposes, right? So we've heard issues about, lack of governance and questions around data integrity, but also the fact that the data for students lives in different data systems, from the learning management systems to the student information systems. And very often those aren't integrated, say with like a data warehouse or a reporting tool. That sort of lack of integration is only exacerbated by the fact that there's not enough open data standards to facilitate the integration of data across multiple systems, and that also leads to problems on two different lanes. One, just making sure that you're reporting the right things for compliance purposes, say to IPEDs, right, or say to accreditors like SACs or Middle States. But then also just for ongoing decision-making purposes, ongoing decision support. And the quotes at the top right here really get into that, to try to move from using data purely for compliance purposes to ongoing decision-making. That requires both having data available for those purposes, and then also having the personnel capacity and the democratized access to that data to be able to do that. And so some of the metrics that we hear that folks want to track are listed below. These are less lagging indicators. These are the types of measures that you can check every semester or every year to see how you're performing, particularly if you're adopting the reform efforts that we noted in the 4 pillars earlier, or other reform efforts. And so these include things like credit completion ratio. So that's your number of courses or credits passed over total attempted. So that's for those of you on the call who have depth in financial aid, those would be your satisfactory academic progress, your SAP measures, in a way, kind of like the PACE metric. Knowing what proportion of your students are passing Gateway English and Math in your first year. Different measures around transfer and completion, particularly time to degree and credits to degree, so you can know whether students are taking courses that don't ultimately count towards their graduation, and how long it's taking to graduate on time, or how long it's taking to graduate and how many are graduating on time. And a great indicator of that, this goes to that 15 to finish reform idea. If a student's full-time, what proportion are attempting 15 in their first semester? How many get to 30 in their first year of the part-time students? How many get to 15 in their first year? But then there's kind of this layer where you try to move those metrics by having strong success on the measures that have to do with the reform efforts that you put in place. And those have been very tricky. And one of the things that we've learned through the Digital Learning Infrastructure Initiative are measures around student engagement, and how hard that is to get and how hard that is to quantify. But trying to find, what are the strong metrics that would show up in, say, a learning management system like Canvas or Blackboard or D2L, or in a student information system, such as for an events tracking module that might be turned on in Banner or PeopleSoft, that can capture peer-to-peer interactions, club participation, event attendance, and learning analytics, because that bottom layer can predict how students are doing ultimately at this middle layer, because it's measuring how well certain reforms are going, and how much that leads to the ability to make progress on the measures that change every semester. And then that in turn goes to the more lagging indicators around college completion. So one of the things that we keep hearing though is that all sounds well and good, but there's not really a ton of time to be pushing on these things. Our big issue is the compliance priorities, and so I've listed just the logos or a picture of a state house, but essentially they come from 3 different areas, right? I mean, there's more than this, but it's mostly state, federal, and accreditor. These are actual quotes from our digital learning infrastructure participants around the fact that, as that top quote makes abundantly clear at the end, that decision support becomes extra, that there's just simply not enough time, not enough hours in the day, let alone infrastructural capacity to be able to get to this place. So the question is, how do you get there? So one thing that we already covered, but kind of the first step, is making sure you're getting the right measures. You're measuring what matters, right? So you've kind of got this top layer of graduation and post-completion metrics that should align with your strategic plan for your college. So those are your grad rates and counts by different cohorts, such as 2-year and 2-year, 4-year and 4-year, or if you're including certificates, seeing if students are completing 100% of expected time if they're full-time, or 150% if you're trying to line that up with the most common IPEDS measure. Although at CCA we maintain that the standard to shoot for full-time students anyways is 100% of expected completion time, or 2 years and 2, or 4 years and 4. Post-completion metrics, and then you've got the ones that change every semester, your credit completion ratio, your full-time to 30, part-time to 15, and then you have the ones that are associated with the different pillar reform efforts. Once you've got what you want to measure, then you have to say to yourself, okay, or maybe map out for yourself instead of just talking to yourself, putting together a spreadsheet. Well, where do we presently hold data that would populate these metrics that we say we care about? So if we say that we care about full-time students getting to 30 credits in their first year, how do we know that they're doing that? That's probably something that's going to be report output from your student information system, such as Banner or PeopleSoft or Genzabar or Power Campus, and you're able to use that information to then figure out, on the one hand, which reforms are moving it, and on the other, how much it's predicting ultimate graduation. But in addition, you might have measures that are a little harder to get at, like the ones on the this slide, such as peer-to-peer interactions or event attendance. And you might have measures that you presently just don't track. So let's say you care about introductory math, English pass rates in the first year, particularly if you offer courses that include co-required, co-requisite developmental education, where the readiness coursework is alongside the credit-bearing coursework, or prerequisite, which at CCA we really try to work with colleges to move away from. But just knowing which sections are which requires coding it that way in your student information system. So then that way you can know for students with academic readiness needs who's passing math or English or whatever subject you want to analyze within the first year based on that sort of readiness. So then you have an idea of what data entry standards you need to track that derives from the metrics. So let me bottom line that, because that was a lot. So I'm saying that for every metric, you're going to have different data components that you are going to want to source. And you're going to know whether you already source it, whether you have it, but you just need to introduce different labels into your system, or whether you need to capture it in the system altogether. So some of the more difficult to get at metrics, such as event attendance, might require turning something on in your student information system, or using something that you hadn't used around events, or putting a QR code on a window that students could take pictures of that ultimately uploads into Canvas, or something like that. Then you take all that and you have an idea of what sort of data you need to track manually, what's already automatic, and what can be automated. The picture on the right is an attempt to depict what that could look like from an infrastructural perspective if you are able to bring in the different data silos that are represented by your, for lack of a better way of putting it, your transactional systems, like your student information system, your learning management system, your advising system. You could have that all hit one big data warehouse, which is what it sounds like, just a massive store of data from different sources. Or you could have some of the tools report to different reporting front ends, such as the post-secondary data partnership, which I'll get into shortly. Either way, the idea is to be able to get one view, such that if you want to see, for example, what proportion of students in a given major didn't turn in their first homework assignment, but may have attended a certain event, that's bringing in together 2, maybe 3 different data sources into one view. So being able to get to that from the type of table you create, from knowing what data you need to support your metrics, is kind of a prerequisite task. I kind of already talked about this, but the idea is that those metrics that you create, some of them are going to be your key performance indicators. They may already be labeled as such in your strategic plan. So the types of measures that you care about as a result of your mission. And then you've got the ones that are the leading indicators of your key performance indicators. Then you have metrics that are the leaders of those leading indicators. So again, just to give another example, grad rate might be a KPI. Full-time students getting the 30 credits in their first year might be a leading indicator. And then the proportion of students who avail themselves of advising on a given week may be a leading indicator of students who are going to be on track to get to full-time for getting the 30 credits in their first year if they're full-time. So this kind of puts that into a slide with different sample metrics. I actually want to jump to the next one though. So going into the post-secondary data partnership, this is something that we've been working on with colleges who are part of the Digital Learning Infrastructure Initiative to make sure that they're able to implement that sort of, what I was talking about here, that sort of reporting front end that allows for being able to capture different metrics. Not all of them that are depicted on this slide would be in there, but a lot of them, such as in the progress area or in the college completion area, are in there. And then there's other tools that would be used to source some of the other items. And so what it addresses is going from the different sources for data reporting across the country to having one standard common way of defining these metrics, such that you can compare against other colleges and trade practices. Lining up your metrics second with your student success reforms a little more closely, so you're not wondering, hey, I wonder if this initiative to have more students on semester by semester education plans is working. I guess I'll have to wait till the graduation rates come out, but instead you can look at those interim measures around completion ratio or credit accumulation. Being able to see that pretty well, not having that difficulty in reporting and visualizing the leading indicators, and making sure, I'm not overly enamored with iPads, to say the least. And part of the problem is it doesn't capture all students, and there's some arbitrary aspects of iPads metrics definitions, such as graduation rates only focusing on students who start in the fall for whatever reason, whereas the PDP and other tools like it are actually able to capture students who start in the spring or who start in the summer or who are part-time or who are first gen. And then, finally, being able to use those sorts of leading indicators to have that sort of data at hand that depicts student reality, so you can better make decisions to improve that reality. I'm not going to spend too much time with this, but just know that you can email me or get in touch with me otherwise later. My cell phone's in my email signature, so you can certainly give me a call or text. But this kind of goes into the nuts and bolts of what PDP implementation looks like. But I really wanted to jump to this because this is a depiction that kind of brings it all together, at least to my mind, which is the different types. In fact, I would go ahead and say if there's one slide, and I will be sharing these slides later, that's a common question. But if there's one slide that I think, captures how to think about metrics and data at your college, it's a matter of looking at the different categories of metrics. So I've depicted 4 here that are listed by frequency of change going low to high. So you've got the post-completion and social mobility metrics. Then you've kind of got where I've started a lot when I've been listing these throughout the conversation today, or throughout my slides anyways, with graduation counts and rates. You've got the student success measures that lead to graduation, then you've got your day-to-day interventions. And so the idea is that you can map what metrics you care about, what data is still needed, and which reform efforts are associated with each. And you can see on the side, where this different data lives. The top area, I kind of mixed the types of sources where you both get data, but also to whom you report data. So National Student Clearinghouse, for example, does a lot of reports that will show on a per state basis anyways. And then for your college, if you're using it per college, different of those post-completion outcomes, particularly if you're a 2-year college, how many students are transferring and where they're going, or if you're 4-year, how many are going to master's programs and where. But then you've also got the White House College Scorecard, which provides good information for your college on post-completion indicators such as median wage or percent employed in area of their study. Other Department of Ed data that could be pertinent just from your state, and obviously stuff you can pull from iPads. Those middle metrics, as well as the credits to degree and time to degree, are covered by the post-secondary data partnership. And then finally, the leading indicators of those are at the bottom of this slide: your student information system, your learning management system, your advising systems, that get at the measures that change on a more frequent basis, such that you're able to work your way up. And if you can imagine, if you improve the needle on the bottom ones, then the bigger needles on the middle areas also move forward and ultimately move the biggest hands on the clock. So the last thing, but maybe the most important thing, is ultimately, if you know what metrics you care about from this sort of an overview, or however you want to list it out, then who's having the right conversations about the right metrics at the right time, such that there's a regular cadence to using data to improving the lives of your students. And so I've kind of put a 2x2 here of metrics, and then what I'm calling performance dialogues. I do want to come up with a better name, but the idea of talking about what's changing in the reality you're depicting based on the measures you're choosing. So you might have a long-term metric. So for example, which KPIs are changing with less frequency. Very often, the most common statewide attainment goal is having 65% of working age adults having a credential value by 2025. So knowing those completion metrics, you might have something else for your college, but the idea is like your more lagging indicators would go in there, and the people who would talk about it or would dialogue about it are your, potentially something that would come up at a CFO meeting or at a board meeting or something like that. Whereas the next level is your leading indicators that are the overview of the metrics that were kind of captured on this slide on the bottom two sections, and saying, okay, well, who's meeting at what cadences to come up with the action items that can improve the outcomes. And so if we break that down a little bit in terms of what those sorts of conversations could look like, it allows for not putting all of the data responsibilities on the institutional research function at your college, especially if that function is really, really stretched, but just having more democratized data access. So to that second bullet in the top left, so every individual in the organization has ownership and responsibility in realizing goals, making sure that there's really strong leadership and management capacity that comes through working with data to address the problems that you're seeing. And then, of course, changing the metrics, constantly refining is itself building that sort of bottom left culture of data inquiry to encourage everybody to creatively and persistently inquire on data at hand to understand complex problems, and then ultimately turn that into the type of measure that you would look at on a weekly or monthly. And I would say the bottom right is, I've kind of been hinting at this in the other three, because I think I might redo this slide to make the bottom right one kind of the centerpiece, because it's the most important point, which is having a really strong culture of action and accountability that arises from knowing what metrics you care about, where the data is going to come from, and knowing how it's going to change on a weekly or monthly basis, and who's going to talk about it to see how things are going. So I gave an example. This is dummy data that's supplied from an actual dashboard that's shared weekly during a fall registration cycle. That also looks at the graduation rate cohort, and just looking at where it's at this week, last time. This is just an example of in PowerPoint how you can manually build the type of dashboard you want. In this instance, this is a slide I've used in a different context where there's a system of colleges. So you can imagine thinking about this if you're at one college, what it could look like for a different departments. But looking at, okay, well, we said that we care about what proportion of part-time students are getting a 15. We know that that means and full-time students getting the 30. We know that that means in the case of, say, full-time students getting a 30, we know that we want all students to be on academic plans. So here is, with dummy data for our system, we see that college 3 is at 50% of students have plan activity. For new students, 50% of them. For first-time full-time, 50%. And you can see for all students at colleges C1, C2, and C4 are at different rates and are lower than college number 3. So if you imagine setting up a weekly dialogue on this metric, this looks like then the leadership around education planning in colleges 1, 2, and 4, asking college 3 what they're doing and then seeing how they can improve. Because the idea is anything low or red, that doesn't mean bad. That's just depicting what reality is and seeing how you can collaborate to change that reality on behalf of students. This is a potential, when I share these slides out, this is a potential very, very basic table for creating some of the things that I was discussing earlier of, what's the student success metric you care about, what's the associated reform effort, and what's the reform metric. So for example, in this slide, full-time students getting the 30 credits would go in the first column, getting all students on education plans would go in the next one. I'm sorry, yeah, that's right. Getting all students on education plans reform. And then the metric is what proportion of students are actually registering according to a semester by semester plan. I'm gonna stop here. Webinars are a little weird because it's not as conducive to dialogue. But I am curious, what are some thoughts, comments, what resonates, what doesn't, what are some questions? So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to look at the Q&A, but also please feel free to share anything as you're thinking about it at this juncture. All right, let me see. So are there any questions? Because right now there's nothing that comes up in the Q&A. I won't call on anybody because that's not fair. But I know some of the attendees, and it's tempting, but that's not fair. That's asymmetrical. I can see you. But come on. Throw out some questions. Was there anything that, here we are. Of the KPIs that you have mentioned, which ones have you seen shared as the most important? That's a really good question. I think that the most important ones, I mean, it's going to differ per college, right? But for the ones that are at that strategic plan level, the graduation rates for full-time students at 100% of expected time, and then for part-time students within a 3 or 4 year time frame, if at a 2-year college, or at a 6-year time frame at a 4-year college. I know that sounds aggressive, but if you manage towards that, then the right reforms start coming into place, right? Because then you start looking at structured schedules and new modalities and these sorts of things. I would say that at the next layer down, as a result of that, very important metrics, if I could choose 2, would be the first would be, your basic retention metrics, particularly fall to fall or year to year, if it's a spring start or spring to spring, for example. And then proportion of students that are passing both intro English and math in their first year. We have found that some colleges that make dramatic changes there, particularly moving from prerequisite-driven remediation to co-requisite-driven remediation can see up to a 10-fold increase in graduation rates, and that's usually at parity, regardless of race, ethnicity, or Pell status. And then I would say that for part of your question also kind of implies what are the most important reform efforts. And so obviously, as would be implied in what I just said, certainly moving away from prereq-driven remediation, if you have it at your college, is really critical. Also making sure all students are actually registering on the semester by semester academic plan, so they've got that purpose on the one hand, and they've got the route to achieve that purpose. And then that also allows for understanding what courses you need to have available on the back end of things. So I think lots of things are important, but those are the ones that have jumped out in CCA's experience. And so it's not coincidental that a lot of our publications have to do with that, because the evidence base is quite high. Any other questions? I'm just going to give it one more minute, and then if there aren't any, we can go ahead and end a little early. I do want to take a second as well to promote other items in our series. So hold on one second. Share my screen one more time. Oh, we've got a couple more questions. What systems or software do you recommend to share live dashboards with administrators? I certainly would recommend the post-secondary data partnership. That's not going to solve everything, but it's relatively inexpensive. It can be difficult to implement only because getting the components lined up that are required to be able to track the types of metrics that I've just mentioned is kind of like the key work to be done. And then also I would say, I would go at it very metrics first. So let's say I'll give my own personal experience, because I used to lead student success at the City Colleges of Chicago. That's where I got my start. And what we did is, we said, okay, well, we're going to put a stake in the ground and say it's incredibly important that all students are on semester by semester academic plans. And if that's the case, and we're saying that that's important, we need to measure that. Well, at the time that I was there, this was like 10 years ago, we didn't presently have at that moment an advising tool for students to register onto that. We had to use Word documents and Excel. So I asked the advisors to have a naming convention that would make it clear that an academic plan had been completed in full, and then the deans would count that up. And so we were always able to report on the proportion. So now the software that does that sort of thing, well, there's lots of different tools, but it's really making sure that that metric is right. So I guess, some of that's going to be like individualized, and I would certainly be more than happy to have a call based on your present tech infrastructure to know what can make the most sense. But I think, just having that metric right is pretty critical. I do think lots of advising tools can get, really pricey. And so, maybe if we need to, through this HBCU DLI initiative, create more open source answers to these sorts of technical problems, then maybe that's just one of the things that we have to be pushing towards too as a group. There's a question. I'm happy that we are drilling down to analyze data on routine basis to drive decisions. Have you noticed that HBCUs are embracing these new reforms, and how can we get everybody on the same page? That's a really great question. I think that there are plenty of HBCUs that are beginning to address these reforms, and lots of my colleagues, notably, especially my supervisor, Danifu Elston, who will be presenting tomorrow on learnings around digital learning infrastructure thus far, will be able to speak to that. I think a few things though. So one is that we need to act more as a network of colleges to compare and contrast how we're doing at these reform efforts. And so that's, you know, a great way to leverage certain events, you know, whether it's the UNCF Unite conference or, you know, CCA's annual convening conference. I can put that in the chat in a second. And I think that, you know, trying to get to more standard tools. Again, I don't mean to be a broken record about the post-secondary data partnership, but the more that HBCUs and all colleges use that, you know, that has within the tool, a benchmarking feature for selecting just for HBCUs, how are HBCUs doing on these given reform efforts that are not tracked in IPEDS. And that's critical as well. So I think that, you know, this is kind of a loose thing to say, and I really should have more evidence to back up this statement, but I think that HBCUs are incredibly strong on the student engagement front. I think that the measurements of it are that there's momentum around it, but we're still, you know, in a little bit of a nascent stage, and that when it comes to software standards, that's also, you know, across HBCUs, really just getting started, and that's true for non-HBCUs as well. But I think that there's tremendous value in introducing that for HBCUs overall. And it sounds like the PDP initiative is a partnership with IPEDS to centralize more of the data points. If so, how quickly would information be updated for on-time accuracy? So the PDP is actually not really about IPEDS. So the way it works is, you know, so IPEDS, right, we all have to send data to it. And they typically ask for, you know, your basics around demographic information, enrollment information, financial HR, your different ops stuff. And then, you know, besides retention, most of the outcomes are really about grad rates, right? And how many students are getting degrees. The problem is that doesn't really get to stuff that changes every year or every semester. And that's where the post-secondary data partnership comes in. And it's able to track metrics that IPEDS just doesn't track. And the idea behind that is, you know, there are other tools, of course, besides the PDP that are considerably more expensive, that track these metrics as well. But the advantage of the PDP, and this is why I think it relates to IPEDS, is that right now there's 500 plus customers on it, and that's mostly public colleges, degree granting colleges, and in the undergrad space, that'd be like a third. If it ever gets to critical mass, which I think it will, like a half or further, then you're going to have everybody also on the PDP. And then when everybody's on the PDP, then we can start comparing on measures that change in more real time. And then you can create a lot more bottom-up advocacy networks. So I realize that's like a very jargony way to say it'll be easier for colleges to help each other with helping students, because they'll be able to share information on what works, because they'll be able to see how they're doing on these measures that change way more frequently than the measures that are submitted to IPEDS change, if that makes sense. And I forgot, I meant to put in the annual convening link in the chat. And let me also share my screen one more time. So yeah, this is just to say that on Friday, tomorrow, around the same time, there's going to be a preview of insights and themes that have come out of digital learning infrastructure work thus far. And then next week, we're going to go into, you know, different, going back to that value of student centrism and how that's been playing out throughout this project, as well as getting into critical IT investments and tech selection, as has kind of come up with, or we've touched upon, at least as regards data and metrics in this session. So please stay tuned for that. And obviously, you know, like I said, I'll share these slides. For those of you on the call who know me, you know that I try to make myself incredibly available, and you know that includes, you know, my email and cell. Other questions or thoughts? Just give it a minute. Okay, well, oh, here we are. Excellent. Sounds like we have identified some predictive data points. Are they being scaled up for others to implement? I think so. I'm trying to think, like, I'm going to give an attempt at this, but I'm nervous I'm repeating myself. So please make sure that I'm understanding the question right, and ask it a little differently if I'm not. But basically, I think that HBCUs are increasingly standardizing on common predictors of college completion, right? So I think this begins to answer your question, right? So like these metrics such as passing intro math and English in your first year, credit completion ratio, full-time to 30, part-time to 15, transfer activity, credits to degree, time to degree. These are increasingly standard. What's becoming less, or I shouldn't say becoming less standard, but what still requires a lot of work is that level down to say, all right, well, for all the student success reform efforts that are out there, particularly the ones that I went through in the 4 pillars of CCA reforms, what are those metrics? How are they crosswalking to those predictors I just mentioned? And how's that going across the sector? And that's still very much a work in progress. I mean, at CCA, we've kind of mapped it and everything, but, you know, being able to share that, talk about it. I mean, you know, it certainly is coming up anecdotally. I can tell you that it comes up a lot at different convenings and events. But, you know, is there a book that's established it and a survey that's indicated who's using what measures out of, you know, the 100 plus HBCUs? That I don't know. And I think it's just getting started. But yes, there are metrics that show outcomes on those sorts of data points, right? So, you know, so for each one of those reform efforts, right, you would take what the appropriate metric would be. So, you know, I kind of went a little more in depth on one of them, right? All students on education plans looks like what proportion of students are on ed plans. And I think, you know, students passing math or English in the first year, I touched on that one a little bit too, where it's like, okay, well, these are the students who are taking, say, co-requisite driven remediation instead of prerequisite driven remediation. But if you start looking at some of the other ones I didn't talk about, so career exploration, you know, it kind of goes into how you're creating that reform at your college. So if you're saying, all right, well, we're going to make sure that every student who doesn't declare a major in their first semester or in their first year has to see a career advisor. All right, what proportion of those students have seen a career advisor? Are we measuring that week to week? Another example would be in the support pillar. So, you know, if you might want to make sure that every student who's deemed, quote, at risk of attrition, and that would be something that you would define maybe as an amalgam of different statuses that could be, you know, academic, or maybe like a flag based on not turning in a homework assignment, that could automate a note to an advisor that says, hey, this student on your caseload needs to see you. What proportion of those students are being seen? What's the average duration? And then how has that changed or influenced their retention? So there are measures for all of those weekly, daily things. And I think the trick is, you know, the biggest trick of all is making sure that those lead to the predictors of college completion, which in turn lead to the metrics around college completion itself. Really good question. Other questions? We've got like a couple minutes left. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And this was, you know, a pretty robust Q&A at the end. And please, you know, I've put in the chat different links and contact info. Avail yourself of it. If you've got feedback that, you know, I need to know or should know, or if you want to talk about implementing some of this at your college, just hit me up. I'm right here at CCA. So thank you. And I hope to, for those of you who I recognize, I hope to see you again very soon. And for those of you who I don't, I hope to meet you very soon. Thank you so much. Yes, I'll send a copy, and please email me and we can get started on working on this at your college. All right, I'm going to stop recording and I'll hang out for a minute.